Hello, a wonderful welcome to our human rights talk on the consequences the COVID crisis had on human rights or has on human rights, still going on. I apologize for the delay, but we have an exciting evening planned here. The event is organized by the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute of Fundamental Human Rights, University of Vienna, and Amnesty International Austria. My name is Sarah Emler. I'm a journalist for the Austrian Public Broadcaster, and I have the honor of guiding you through this very exciting evening. Let me give you a quick overview. First, we'll have a quick introduction on the topic by Ursula Kriebaum, Professor of Public International Law at the University of Vienna. This is being followed by the keynote speech by the Council of Europe Commissioner Dunja Mijatović, the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, obviously. Following the keynote, we will have a hopefully vivid discussion. The commissioner will join us, as well as her preceding commissioner, the preceding commissioner for human rights, Niels Mujnieks. I'm sorry, apologies. And including Rosa Logar and Michael Lysander Fremuth, who fortunately stepped in since Werner Amon is unable to come today. The event is being streamed online and will be available afterwards. And you, my dear audience, are welcome to participate in the chat. Please ask questions and we'll hopefully answer them. But first, may I please ask Ursula Kriebaum for the introduction.
A very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Fundamental Rights, on behalf of Amnesty International Austria, and on behalf of the University of Vienna to this second human rights talk after we have relaunched it in February 2020. Due to the pandemic, it did not take place any earlier, and we are meeting virtually. But the pandemic at least provided us with an interesting topic for this year's Human Rights Day, COVID-19 and human rights, lessons learned from the pandemic. The Council of Europe issued a toolkit for member states already in April 2020 on how to respect democracy, the rule of law and human rights during the COVID-19 crisis. Be sure I'm not giving a talk about this now, but we are very happy to have Dunja Mijatović, the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, as our keynote speaker, and a very distinguished panel, which Sarah Emler is going to present to you, and a plentiful field of topics that are interesting during this crisis. So I wish all of us, on behalf of the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute, Amnesty International Austria, and the university, a very interesting evening. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ursula Kriebaum. And now we're turning to the keynote speech of a person who devoted her life promoting and protecting human rights, in particular when it comes to freedom of expression, if I may say so. I would just like to point out that before Dunja Mijatović was elected Commissioner of Human Rights at the Council of Europe, she served as a representative of freedom of media. I guess someone has his microphone on. Before Dunja Mijatović was elected Commissioner for Human Rights at the Council of Europe, she served as a representative of freedom of media for the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. And before that, she was the director of the Communication Regulatory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. She received several human rights prizes and also has been very active in supporting NGO activities in the field of human rights education and asylum. And now I'll stop here. And Commissioner, will you do us the honor?
Thank you. I hope you can hear me and see me properly. Is that the case?
Yes, we can hear you and see you very well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, for this introduction. First of all, thank you, Ludwig Boltzmann Institute and Amnesty, for inviting me. and also for organizing this extremely important event on Human Rights Day. My plan was to visit Austria, to visit Vienna, to meet with many of you, but unfortunately we have to cope with this situation, hopefully not for too long. With this in mind, I think it's also extremely important to mention that we are gathering online in cyberspace on Human Rights Day, saying that our rights, first of all, are same offline and online. I am really honored to have such a distinguished colleagues in the panel, and I will try to tackle issues of importance also in relation to my work in previous months during this unprecedented and very important time. 2020 has been a disastrous year for human rights in Europe. While increasingly commitment to upholding human rights standards has been faltering all over the continent for several years, the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the erosion of the democratic fabric of our society, on which protection of human rights ultimately depends. The pandemic has upended our lives in the same way that 9/11 and 2008 financial crisis did, and possibly more so. It has also provided many governments with an ideal pretext to exploit fears and crack down on dissent, restrict people's rights, and pass emergency legislation that risks having long-term consequences beyond the health crisis. I think it is not exaggerating to say that we are at a crossroads. The direction we decide to take now will shape the type of society we want to live in and pass on to future generations. That choice will determine whether we bolster our freedoms or we relinquish them, promote participation or undermine democracy, empower people or marginalize them. I'm therefore grateful and truly honored for today's opportunity to be among the distinguished speakers who will be discussing the impact of COVID-19 on human rights and how to move forward. Today's discussion takes place on the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a landmark text that has inspired and transformed the lives of millions of Europeans. Predicated on the principle of equality of all human beings, it became the alma mater of many legally binding human rights conventions, national constitutions, and a huge body of human rights standards. Over the past 72 years, much progress has been achieved, and we need to make sure that we do not forget this. Many more people have become free from oppression, free from poverty, free to live the lives they want. Yet not all have benefited from the progress in the same way. For a long time, European societies have entertained the illusion that human rights violations are merely surface cracks in an otherwise solid edifice. An invisible virus has deepened those cracks and put paid to that illusion. The pandemic has magnified all existing inequalities in Europe and has exacerbated many of them. We were not equal before the pandemic, and we have not been equal in the face of it. Those who were poor before it have become poorer. Those who were disadvantaged now face even greater disadvantages. Those who were marginalized are marginalized even more than before. The case of older people is emblematic, and I triggered this issue at the very beginning of pandemic. In many of our member states, they have paid the highest price, not only because of the health vulnerabilities necessarily associated with age, but also because of the social settings in which many of them live. Those living independently have also suffered because of the lockdown measures that have further isolated them from their families and the rest of the community. The pandemic has also shone a light on the structural problems affecting health systems in many of our member states. Years of austerity measures have led to a clear erosion of public health infrastructures, personnel, and means. My predecessor in the post of Commissioner for Human Rights, Nils Muizhnieks, rang the alarm bell soon after the economic crisis started in 2008, highlighting the many impacts austerity measures would have on human rights. Sadly, he was right. Dear Nils, your presence among us today is much appreciated, and I look forward to hearing your contribution to our discussion later. Your voice is now needed more than ever before. The pandemic has also exposed the ubiquity of gender inequality. This is evident in the workplace, where deep-rooted societal attitudes keep women in a subordinate role, the persistence of violence against women, and the increasing attempts to limit women's sexual and reproductive health and rights, which are the result of ingrained patterns of inequalities between women and men. Cases of domestic violence have increased exponentially during the lockdowns imposed in many European countries. Despite measures adopted by some governments to alleviate the suffering and counter the problem, much remains to be done. The views of experts like Rosa Logar, who is with us today, will be crucial in exploring ways in which we can join forces to address this problem more effectively. Another field in which the pandemic has shown that we are still not all equal is access to the internet. This is particularly worrying at a time when school closures in some European countries have compelled millions of students to rely on the internet to study and build the foundations of their future. A recent UN report estimates that 2/3 of school-aged children worldwide have no internet at home. The executive director of UNICEF has talked about it being a digital canyon rather than a digital divide. I cannot agree more, and I consider this problem as one of the most pressing ones to solve, because it will have long-lasting negative impact if it remains unaddressed. I look forward to hearing from Lysander Fremuth, whose experience, including in the field of teaching, can help shed light on how we might bridge the canyon. The global health problem caused by COVID-19 have also highlighted the importance of combating disinformation that can cause panic and social unrest. Some governments, however, have used this imperative as a pretext to introduce disproportionate restrictions on press freedom. Parliaments, governments, and local authorities have adopted or are discussing legislation, decrees, or decisions that clearly risk hampering the work of journalists and media actors and restrict the public's right to receive information. Other measures restricting freedom of assembly have been used to undercut the ability of human rights defenders and civil society to act in defense of human rights and aid the most vulnerable. In several member states of the Council of Europe, such measures have been adopted under special regimes, what is often referred to as a public health state of emergency, implying in many cases derogations of the European Convention on Human Rights. The Convention and other human rights standards offer the necessary flexibility to adapt to emergency situations. At a time where populism tends to favor cutting corners to solve problems, however, states must especially be careful not to send the wrong signal that implementation of human rights standards may undermine the fight against the pandemic. On the contrary, this pandemic has shown that all those particularly affected, be it older persons, persons with disabilities, women, children, Roma, detainees, migrants, LGBTI people, or media professionals, share a common denominator: their rights were not being fully respected before COVID-19, it has also shown the importance of placing the human rights to health at the very center of the design of our health systems. Enhanced protection of human rights can thus be an asset in rather than an obstacle to preventing and alleviating the negative effects of such pandemic. The few examples of the ways the pandemic and the measures adopted to stop it are impacting human rights, which I just mentioned, provide a clear lesson for all of us, governments, parliaments, elected officials, public figures, individual citizens. We can no longer afford to procrastinate in realizing human rights for all. We need a renewed impetus now. The many challenges that our societies will have to face require us to give greater prominence to human rights in our societies, starting with more emphasis on the equal enjoyment of social and economic rights and equal access to healthcare and education. There is no easy fix, but taking the decision to address these long-standing problems is already a good start. The founding principles and values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are as relevant today as they were when they first emerged from bloodshed, tyranny, and war. They require governments to become more robust, defenders of human rights, and to strengthen multilateralism. No single country can solve the complex human rights challenges that this health crisis poses, nor those that will come with future crises. Respecting and fulfilling human rights is primarily the responsibility of state authorities. In the current context, it is crucial to ensure that emergency legislation remains in place only for the time necessary to stop the pandemic and to introduce the least intrusive measures possible, and to ensure that all this is rolled back as soon as the authorities have the pandemic under control. Defending and promoting human rights is about the big and the small actions we all take every day, however. If we want society to function more in line with human rights standards and principles, we must all make an extra effort and move out of our comfort zones. For a start, the human rights community, including international organizations, should take a long, hard look at itself. I think it is partly our fault if many people have lost interest in or become dissatisfied with human rights. We have not been sufficiently effective in ensuring that everybody understands why human rights are important for all. For instance, violations of certain human rights, especially some economic and social rights, should probably be given more prominence on our agenda. We must become more inclusive in the way we defend human rights. We deliver a public service in the interest of society, but we do not own that service. We talk about, for, and sometimes with people who have suffered human rights violations, but we rarely empower them to speak for themselves. They should take part in decision-making processes as much as possible. We should learn to listen more and leave them space to tell their stories and shape the policies and laws that concerns them. Lawyers, scholars, intellectuals, and concerned citizens must enter the arena of public debate on human rights and engage with society at large to overcome misinterpretation and dispel prejudice. The media, too, must be part of the solution by using precise terms that inform the public factually and objectively on all matters of public interest, while avoiding sensation, improper language, or reporting in ways that may raise the alarm unnecessarily or provide a platform for divisive views to spread. It is also more important than ever that we protect and promote the idea grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that human rights are universal and indivisible. We must all work to defend not only our own rights, but also those of others. We must therefore engage with friends, with colleagues, family members, neighbors, local and national authorities, and show that human rights are not an abstract concept, but very concrete issues, the absence of which can have various consequences, as the pandemic has shown. If we look away anytime human rights are denied, we might stay safe ourselves, but we leave others in danger. And tomorrow, those others could be us. 2020 may go down in history as one of the worst years for human rights in Europe. Or it might be remembered as the year of the turning point, when more and more people demanded a central role for human rights in public policies. Let's work together to make this happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting keynote speech, Commissioner. Well, this builds a great foundation for our discussion coming now. The Commissioner is going to join us for this, but also her predecessor, Mr. Dunja Mijatović. He, prior to being the Commissioner for Human Rights, held a variety of leadership positions in academia, government, and civil society, and he's currently the director of the European Regional Office at Amnesty International, which covers the EU, the Balkans, and Turkey. I'm also very happy that Mrs. Rosa Loga is joining us on the virtual discussion table. She devoted her life, if I may say so, to fight violence against women. She's one of the founders of the Austrian Women's House, Shelter for Battered Women, and a member of many international committees and task force to combat violence against women. As I mentioned at the beginning, unfortunately, Werner Amon cannot take part today, but I'm very glad that Michael Lysander Fremuth had time to step in. Thank you so much for being here. Michael Lysander Fremuth is the scientific director of the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute of Fundamental Human Rights at the University of Vienna. He originally studied law, always with an international focus, which brought him to many countries, including the US, South Africa, Russia, and Turkey. And his research and lecturing activities here in Vienna focus on national, supranational, and international human rights protection. And now, before we get into the discussion, I would like to remind our audience that you are welcome to ask questions in the chat. Please do so. If you have a specific question, if you have a question directed at a specific person, just add the name as well. All right, let's get into it. Dunja Mijatović, I would like to ask you first because I guess, the Commissioner mentioned in the keynote that right after the financial crisis in 2008, you warned the impact austerity measures have on human rights. Can you just quickly elaborate the human rights situation before the pandemic and maybe your thoughts on the current situation?
Yes, that's a tough order to cover all of human rights before the pandemic. First of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be on the same event with Dunja, whose work I respect so much. I'm so pleased with what she's done with the office and excellent overview of human rights in the pandemic. I think that before the pandemic, what were the big issues on our agenda in the human rights world in Europe? I mean, I think you had the lingering impact of austerity. For example, child poverty, youth unemployment, problems in access to justice, and Europe had still not recovered even 10 years after the financial crisis. You had the national populist threat to democracy, culminating in Trump and Brexit, but showing its face in many areas around Europe, starting with Golden Dawn in Greece and Marine Le Pen in France and elsewhere, but also finding manifestation in severe human rights backsliding in a number of countries: Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Russia, Azerbaijan. You had the Ukraine crisis starting in 2013, which continues to this day. You had the migration crisis, which continues to this day. You had terrorist attacks and problematic responses, which I think is still the order of the day. And you had a crisis in multilateral institutions. So many of those problems still exist now. I would say most of them do. Some are more entrenched than ever, but we have new problems on top of the old ones. We have everything related to the pandemic. We have the Armenian-Azeri war. We have the crisis in Belarus. And on top of it all, we had climate change, which we now recognize as being a major human rights challenge. But I would say 5-10 years ago, we did not really speak of it in that way. So I would say we have some of the same problems, but we have new ones on top of the old ones.
Thank you very much. I think you started talking about certain topics. I think we'll get back to them later on throughout the discussion. Michael, Lysander, Fremuth, you've studied the impact or the effects of globalization on the concept of statehood and sovereignty. What are your thoughts on the handling of the pandemic, like observing it? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's very interesting to see that states have adopted a very different approach for tackling the pandemic on the international level, but also within the European Union. You know, some states like China, Russia, partly France, have enacted strict curfews or even house arrests to stop the transmission of the virus. And this entailed severe restrictions on human rights, freedom of movement, personal freedom, religion, assembly, just to mention a few. And we also see other states like the United States of America or Sweden that have, at least initially, opted for a more liberal approach with little or no limitations on personal freedoms, while many states in Europe try to choose a middle course and strike a fair balance between the competing interests, which is on the one hand, effectively fighting COVID-19, protecting life and health of people, and on the other hand, not to infringe human rights in a disproportionate manner. And that required a constant adaptation to scientific knowledge, to development of the virus and societal realities. Commissioner Mijatović has stated in her wonderful keynote that in fighting the pandemic, we must adhere to the universality of human rights. Yeah, fair enough, I fully agree. However, universality does not mean uniformity. And that is corresponding with the sovereignty of states and the right to self-determination. What do I mean? Well, even under the European Convention on Human Rights, states enjoy a certain margin of appreciation concerning the level of health protection they strive for, as well as concerning the means they intend to use. So there is room for political maneuver and to find the best solutions for the respective societies. In other words, human rights do not tell the states in all detail how to fight the pandemic. They do, however, impose limitations for political action and steering, obviously. But even those legal limitations differ on the global scale. For instance, in Asian countries, data technology has been widely used for contact tracing and thereby fighting the pandemic. In Europe, in contrast, we have a very high level of data protection, and we might discuss whether this potentially could cause difficulties for the states concerns. So I would say it's too early for an overall assessment. Yeah, but we see that we cannot win the fight against COVID-19 by disrespecting human rights. Yeah, and even if harsh restrictions on human rights might insinuate a better outcome, that is a more efficient tackling of the pandemic, and that is very much the story China tries to tell, the overall societal costs are too high to bear. Yeah, it's all about finding and striking a fair balance, not to underestimate the virus as it potentially happened in the United States, but also not to sacrifice human rights as we might detect in China.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fremuth. I would like to address the Commissioner, Dunja Mijatović, directly afterwards, because you said we have to find a right balance. Like Mr. Fremuth said, we have to find the right balance. But in your keynote speech, Commissioner, you mentioned that some states may use the pandemic to introduce measurements to intervene in human rights. And if I remember correctly, in spring, you raised the alarm on Hungary. Would you like to comment on the balance here?
Yeah, balance is a word that I'm quite allergic to because sometimes, you know, balance could mean something that can cause huge problems in the society. I'm all for certain margin of appreciation. I'm all for room for political maneuver and sovereign states, but the key is implementation. And if this so-called balance is not misused in order to introduce certain laws, certain legislations, all in the name of margin of appreciation that affect human rights during COVID or not related to COVID at all. So this is hugely important. And it is really based on the facts. It is based on my experience working with states of the Council of Europe and beyond, talking to the authorities, trying to understand the reasoning behind certain moves in order to explain that this is something needed in the society. And we had this even before COVID. Many security laws and safety issues that were introduced by several states were all in the name of safety and security. But how much those laws had a negative impact on rights of people, including freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, access to information in general, is something that is present and it's visible. It is not good what has been done in the previous period, to put it mildly. So what I'm against is misusing the fact that universality is sometimes explained as a control, instead of really implementing all those conventions, all those resolutions, all the commitments that many states agreed voluntarily when they became members of different international organizations, including Council of Europe, UN, OSCE, and many other organizations, EU. So these rights are not something that is suddenly imposed on the states. How they implement this, how they try to explain this to their citizens, and why they do it is another question. Is it a pure politicization, or it is something really for the benefits of the society? In my view, and based again on facts and talking to civil society, to many courageous, important NGOs, to many authorities, to many governments, most of the time you scratch it on surface and you see that what has been done is really in order to impose certain authoritarian rule, to control societies, to restrict critical voices in the society. So we have to be very careful. Pandemic also exposed all those problems even more than ever before. I'm trying to be optimistic, but at the same time, I'm also very realistic. And I look at those issues based on really my country visits, my talks, and not just sitting in Strasbourg and writing letters and talking about these things that are affecting our societies, and in this case, the most vulnerable groups. You mentioned, Sarah, you mentioned Hungary, but Hungary is not the only state. There are many more.
Well, thank you very much. And I guess it's really hard because you just mentioned that you visit the other countries and try to really engage that right now with all the borders being brought up. it's really hard to do the job from Strasbourg. Before I ask a question to Rosa Loga, I would like to remind the audience again that please feel free to ask any questions in the chat, and I'll try to ask them to our panel. So you get the answers to your questions you want to have answered. And Rosa Loga, the pandemic, during the pandemic, one of the measurements the countries implemented, especially European countries, is lockdowns, many of them, between soft and hard lockdowns, which resulted in people staying at home. But sometimes home is not the safest place. Could you elaborate on how the situation when it comes to domestic violence was before the pandemic and how the situation is now? What are your thoughts on this? Ms. Loga, I think your microphone is not on. I think you're still on mute.
Sorry. Sorry. Thank you to the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute and to the Amnesty Austria for inviting me to this human rights talk. And I will focus on the issue of violence against women and domestic violence, which is my main topic. I'm very glad to join here also, not only because I'm working for many years here in Austria on this issue, but also because I have been an expert for the Council of Europe, and I'm still working to draft the Istanbul Convention and also monitor the Grevio, be in the Grevio committee to monitor the Istanbul Convention. So I'm very happy that I can join. Yeah, violence against women, as we know, is human rights problem. It's a human rights violation. That's not something that has been seen like that always. It's fairly new to see it like that. And it's a pandemic in itself. It's a pandemic in the pandemic now with COVID-19. And unfortunately, it's an ongoing pandemic that lasts for, we don't even know how long, hundreds or thousands of years. It's a global problem. There is no country in this world that doesn't have the problem of violence against women and domestic violence. Contrary to what some countries or political groups or even governments want us to think, it's not a problem of a special culture. In Austria, unfortunately, we have lately in the past years started to discuss that it's maybe an imported problem, that it comes from the migration and asylum seekers. So we have been trying to picture it as a foreign problem, which is completely against the facts we have, because we know that in Austria, for many years, like in other countries, there's a lot of violence against women. Now, what happened in the COVID crisis with the problem, we have heard that this problem increases. The COVID-19 crisis, as other crises, as war, as armed conflict, as disaster, always increases the problem of violence against women and domestic violence, because women and girls are even more exposed in these times. They have less protection, especially regarding intimate partner violence and domestic violence in the COVID crisis. We can see the situation through the lockdown. Women survivors of violence are restricted in their possibility to seek help, to run away, to turn for help. And at the same time, they are locked in with the aggressor. And the home, as you said, which should be the safe place. And the main message now is stay at home, is not a safe message to women and children who experience domestic violence. So we can also see that the crisis, the COVID crisis, hits certain groups of women specifically hard for various reasons. And I want to name two. One is migrant women. Now we can see an interesting phenomenon here, because migrant women are often working in the service sector, in the care sector, in the low-paid sector, and we could now see in the pandemic that they have a very important role to keep the society running. So there's some hope that that our societies will realize and acknowledge this role, but there is also a danger of making differences. between in the protection, for instance, while some professions can work in home office and are protected and away from the danger of virus, these women often cannot work in home office. They cannot take care of their children who are at home because the schools are closed or can't properly work. So that's a situation where of double discrimination, I would say, that we see with migrant women, and also asylum-seeking women have not the same protection. They are often in cramped accommodation, and I can't join this talk without mentioning the situation of the refugees in Greece. And I'm very sorry and very sad that, as you know, unfortunately, the Austrian government has decided not to take a single refugee out of this horrible situation in the camps. And I hope, and we will work for, that this will change and convince our government that it's very, very important to protect and to save these refugees, especially the children, and also to give them the same support in the COVID crisis.
Thank you very much, Rosa Logam. I would like to continue on this topic, violence against women, then children who cannot go to school, maybe because you talked about the division, like some people are privileged enough to have certain, like where kids can go work at home and have internet, a working internet, have a computer at home. Some women are privileged enough because they have different jobs where they can stay at home, and or parents in general can stay at home and tend to their children. I think the same accounts for healthcare. And maybe Niels Muižnieks, would you like to comment on this as well, on the topic, and maybe go on further on the migration issue as well?
Sure. I mean, I think that children are the most vulnerable in any crisis situation, and I think that this pandemic is no exception. I think these spikes in domestic violence affect children both directly and indirectly, because the abusive man beating a woman also very often beats the child, but indirectly the trauma of witnessing violence will affect these children for a long time. I think the right to education has been seriously hindered, and inequalities in education have grown only deeper. I think the big untold story of the pandemic is that the education gap affecting Roma children has grown even deeper than it was, because they are not getting the kind of access to education online that many other children are. And I think we will see a lot of child poverty as a result of the kind of the socioeconomic fallout of the pandemic. And child poverty will have a long-lasting effect, I think, on all of our societies. On migration, yes, I agree that these are among the people in the most difficult situation in Europe. And I think COVID worsened an already really bad situation for migrants across Europe. A number of countries used the pandemic as an excuse to suspend processing asylum requests. This was a case with Greece and Malta and Switzerland even. I think one thing which was really striking at the beginning of the pandemic and over the summer was that governments throughout Southern Europe prohibited ships in the Mediterranean from disembarking rescued migrants for record periods of time. So you had these ships kind of sailing back and forth with migrants, and nobody would allow them to disembark, claiming that it was too risky under COVID. And I think we saw that many migrants are at risk of COVID as they live in overcrowded, unhealthy detention facilities, camps, or squats. And I think the Moria camp in Lesbos, where 13,000 people were left homeless after a fire, is the most emblematic, but it's certainly not the only such case. But one interesting thing, and this is the last point I'll make on migration, was that I think the pandemic revealed how essential many migrant agricultural workers are to the economy of Europe, because what did you have at the height of the pandemic? The first lockdown, some governments, for example, in the UK and Germany, flew in migrant workers because migrant agricultural workers, because they were so essential and they couldn't, and local workers were not doing the job. And other governments in Spain, Italy, and Portugal quickly regularized some, recognizing indirectly how important, how essential they are to the economy. So I think this was also an interesting kind of side effect of the pandemic. It certainly didn't help their vulnerability, the precarious nature of their work, but it showed how important they are to our societies. But there are huge socioeconomic consequences that we will, I think, only see fully next year of the crisis, where issues pertaining to people running out of furlough payments, running out of sick leave, and so on, social security, but also access to vaccines will be the biggest human rights issue on our agenda for next year.
Now you've taken one of my questions. I was going to ask about the vaccines and help you. But before we go back maybe to this, I would like to maybe address the Commissioner Dunja Mijatović and maybe Mr. Fremuth as well, on the, is the Council of Europe, that was one of the questions from the audience, is the Council of Europe monitoring the derogates from the human rights, is it monitoring the situation very closely? And another question which coincide with this, are you worried that some of the enforced restrictions won't be taken back?
Okay, so the question is, just to be precise, if the Council of Europe is monitoring human rights violations in member states in general? The first question.
Yeah, well, whether it's the Council of Europe is monitoring these violations very closely and maybe reacting to these. That was the first question.
Of course. I mean, I think, it's not just my office when we talk about Council of Europe. There are so many mechanisms and tools and monitoring bodies, from Committee Against Torture, CPT, and many other mechanisms that are monitoring human rights situations in member states. And of course, when it comes to my office, I can talk about this. We do react, not just by making statements, but also engaging with the authorities in question. We also issue so-called human rights comments that my predecessors started. And during COVID pandemic, from the very beginning, we started pointing out about actual problems. I can mention particularly elderly. The first statement I made in order to warn member states about very serious situation when it comes to rights of older persons was dedicated to this. Apart from this tool, I always have possibility to submit third-party interventions, but that is quite a long process. But when it comes to rapid reactions, there are possibilities to immediately engage with governments, to exchange letters, and to make, of course, public statements that sometimes when we see grave human rights violations is the most effective tool that I have at my disposal. Sometimes, speaking loud and direct about grave human rights violations can save somebody's life. So when it comes to real monitoring, I think, this is something I can wholeheartedly confirm. It's happening, and it is, extremely important that even during pandemic, we can function as the organization and use all tools that we have at our disposal. There are many plans for visits, for missions in different parts of Council of Europe, in different parts of Europe. And this is something that will continue. Nevertheless, I mean, now Niels was now talking about migration, and he mentioned Moria in Lesbos. I went twice to Moria, but also to Samos in order to talk to migrants, to talk to the authorities in order to see how we can bridge the problems and how we can make the situation at least bearable for people in need. So yeah, this is happening and it will continue to happen, depending really on the topics and the gravity of violations.
And maybe, oh yeah, go ahead, Mr. Freeman.
Sorry, maybe very brief from a legal perspective. I mean, it is true, and Commissioner has mentioned it in her keynote speech, the European Convention on Human Rights does provide for the opportunity of states to declare a state of emergency. And some states have done so, arguing that they will be better equipped to fight the virus if they take recourse to the state of emergency. However, I think it's very important to stress that even a declared state of emergency will not lead to a total suspension of the rights under the European Convention of Human Rights. It only means that the justification for infringement of concrete human rights might seem to be more easily. I guess that was the hope behind the activities of some states. I fully agree with the Commissioner, and I try to argue together with a colleague, Andreas Sauermoser, in that direction. There was no need to declare a state of emergency. The existing regulation of human rights is sufficiently broad enough, also in terms of justifications for human rights restrictions, to enable the states to sufficiently tackle the COVID-19 crisis. If you're interested, just to give you a very, very brief example, several states decided in the beginning of the pandemics that a general ban on the freedom of assembly is necessary. I disagree, but that was the decision of the state. Even under the existing rules of the European Convention of Human Rights, the European Court of Justice has, the European Court of Human Rights has stated that under certain conditions, a general ban of the freedom of assembly might be justified. Yeah, I'm not arguing in favor of such a general ban. I'm just saying that the existing regulations are sufficient to tackle the crisis. And with regard to your second question, I'm an optimistic person. At least I try to remain an optimistic person. I think whether the restrictive measures become abolished depends on each of us. It depends on civil society organization, but it also depends on judicial surveillance. And if we have independent and impartial national courts, and if access to the European Court of Human Rights is granted, then I see sufficient justification for staying optimistic that these severe restrictions that might have been justified under the pandemic will be abolished once the pandemic has been overcome.
Well, I get to the point of overcoming the pandemic shortly. We have another question from the audience, and it's about the chances the pandemic offers to human rights. And I believe the people have never been as much aware of human rights as now, because some of them have been taken away. Maybe Nils Muichnieks, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Has anything positive come out of the pandemic? What are the opportunities here? One thing which I find fascinating is I think that the pandemic has seen a massive hit to the social and economic rights of so many people across the world, but it's also a huge opportunity to rethink economic and social rights in general. The old orthodoxy, which we saw until very recently, we cannot fulfill social and economic rights because we don't have the money. Well, that's been thrown out the window. Everybody is borrowing money like there's no tomorrow. So it turns out that this was not a real barrier. The barrier was elsewhere. It was a political barrier. So the role of the state in ensuring social and economic rights, I think, is changing very rapidly. And this is a big opportunity to raise the status of economic and social and cultural rights more generally. One thing which I find fascinating also over the last year is that regardless of the restrictions on freedom of movement, on freedom of assembly, this last year has been the year of protest, the year of freedom of assembly across Europe. Look at Belarus, look at Kyrgyzstan, look at Poland and women's rights, look at climate change activists, look at people all over Europe, the Black Lives Matters protests. They've been the protesters have been acting up everywhere. And to me, this energy, this people power has a huge potential because people care about their rights and they're not apathetic, they're not scared, but they're standing up. So I think that's fascinating. I mean, with regards to I think there's an opportunity to recognize the inherent value of many of the workers that we didn't value. I already mentioned migrant agricultural workers. But I think now we have the gig economy workers, we have the cleaners, we have the care home workers, we have the ambulance drivers, we have the nurses. All of these people who are underpaid, have very little social protections, and we have realized how essential they are and how important. And I think that it is a great opportunity to recognize the value of their work, to acknowledge the precarious position that they've been in until now, and to change that for the better. So I see a lot of opportunities there if we seize them, and if we don't let the energy that's been on the streets over the last year dissipate.
Ms. Logar, you would like to comment on that?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in here. I agree with with Niels. It was astonishing to see that politicians were saying we have to address or fight this virus at any cost, and suddenly there was billions of money. But unfortunately, if I may bring an example from Austria here, when the Alliance in Austria to implement the Istanbul Convention, to promote the implementation of the Istanbul Convention, demanded more resources, financial resources to implement the convention. And the success was very little. No? So the Minister for Women Affairs, she has a really small budget of 12 million euro for all women and girls in Austria for 1 year. It's a very tiny budget. It was increased for 2 million to 14 million. So it's very small money in this area, and it didn't increase. Also, so much money politicians took so much money in their hands. So you can see that there's obviously not an agreement where we should spend the money. And for gender equality, it doesn't seem to be a priority. That's what we concluded. So another point I wanted to address is one small thing that was an advantage, or that we in the crisis, or an example from Austria, if you allow me, is the access to justice. We have a system that victims can apply for protection orders to the court, and you might have heard it in the news in Austria. The Minister for Justice, and together also with the NGOs and services, has installed a regulation that services can apply online for a protection order. Victims don't even have to go to court. So that was a big advantage. And this is one that we think should not be taken back, because victims of violence always have the disadvantage that when they go out, they are in danger. They always have restrictions in movement because of the crisis and because of the violence. And I think this is something that we should keep, because with many measures which are restricting, that should be taken back, of course. I agree, but there are some others that open opportunities and can be an advantage for people.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fremuth, would you like to respond to that?
Maybe just a very, very brief reflection of a positive impression I have. I never realized so many people, including media, colleagues, teachers, talking about the right to education, talking about the right to health and the realization in an equal manner. And I think this could be something positive to come out of the crisis. There is, and I think it's comparable to what Niels already said, there is growing pressure in society to address these issues, to shed light on existing patterns of inequalities and discrimination. And in the end, this might pay off and encourage or even force politicians to do better with regard to this economic and social rights. The sad lesson learned could be that obviously we need to a certain degree forms of crisis to realize the deficiencies in our societies. And that would be, a bad thing, but at least that could be a lessons learned. Be better prepared for the next crisis that is highly likely to come, and we will have to face and tackle it.
Thank you very much. Dear Commissioner, I would like you to maybe comment on that too. Would you do us the honor to comment on what the states might do differently in the future, if there's like another crisis, or as you mentioned in the keynote, what the media can do differently? You said the media has a great responsibility, and what can the states and the media learn out of this?
Yeah, we can remain hopeful. I think it's extremely important that we use the impetus and that we really do our best in order to make sure that mistakes are not repeated, particularly when it comes to rights of the most vulnerable groups. I said in my keynote, and I keep repeating this, the most vulnerable groups of our society, the most marginalized groups, they were affected the most. How to make sure that those groups are more protected and that their human rights are not further violated, I think the time will tell. How much wisdom, courage we had as a society in order to move forward. And it is true, there are many people taking the streets, but also joining their forces, their voices, in order to talk about the importance of education, important to of access to health, of rights of the essential workers. All these issues that were somehow hidden from a debate that we keep hearing when we talk about defending human rights. But what remains also to be tackled is, again, violence against women. During pandemic, it also exposed quite toxic narrative that we've been hearing constantly when we spoke about ratification of Istanbul Convention, that in a way we call a gold standard. Some states during pandemic even were talking about moving backwards, even if they ratified. So what we have at the moment is that 34 states of 47 ratified convention. And what we need to be repeating, and this is also an opportunity to say this, that violence against women and domestic violence are human rights violations, which should be combated vigorously. And in particular, I would mention, Rosa Logar was talking about domestic violence. It is not acceptable. We cannot be talking about this in 21st century and hearing the stories. It is a part of culture, tradition. And believe me, this is what I heard on many occasions in my talks to politicians in Europe. Beating your wife or a partner is not part of culture and tradition. It's a crime that needs to be prosecuted. And this is something that will remain very high on my agenda, and hopefully on the agenda of many courageous, important NGOs in Europe and beyond. because we cannot shift these problems away from surface and go back to normal after hopefully pandemic will be something behind us.
Thank you very much. Rosa Logar, would you like to comment on the violence against women issue again? Maybe what is needed in order to combat it?
Yeah, I wanted to point out, I think there's, we could talk for a long time, and the situation in many countries in Europe was not so good before the pandemic regarding the support for survivors of violence against women and domestic violence. We can see that only half of the countries in Europe are fulfilling the minimum standard. In the Istanbul Convention, the recommendation that there should be one shelter place per 10,000 inhabitants. So the situation was already bad, and it has deteriorated through the crisis. We just have to face that. I mean, before, some women and children couldn't flee because there was no shelter, and now there are even more who cannot flee because some shelters have been closed because of the regulations of the pandemic health regulations, or the victims have to go to quarantine, and it has deteriorated even more. So I think this is urgently needed, that we address the needs of survivors of violence for safety, for safe accommodation, immediate safe accommodation, and to increase sustainable funding, and also to look at unwanted consequences of crisis. Like, I give you one example. In Austria, we have a concerning decrease of emergency protection orders by the police in the second lockdown. In the first lockdown, we had an increase of police emergency bearing orders. Now we have a decrease of 25% in the last weeks. We are very concerned about that, because we know there are victims out there who don't get the protection by the police. Now, what is the reason for that? We have to look behind it. Is it because there are less people coming forward? But we can hear stories from people who went to the police but didn't get a bearing order. I think what we can see also is that the police is overwhelmed with all the work they have in keeping the regulations of the pandemic, and they give less priority to other issues, and also to domestic violence. That's not nobody's planning that. It's an unwanted consequence, but we have to face it, that because the police can only do what they can do. So I think the safety of women and children is at stake, because we have other priorities, and if we cannot increase the capacities, then we have serious problem of security for children and women and other vulnerable people. So I think we really have to address this in every country.
It will be probably very important for every country to combat this. I would like to go back to a topic Niels mentioned beforehand, the vaccination, the healthcare issue. Maybe you'd like to respond to it right away. How can we make sure that everybody has, like, who needs or has access to vaccination, who can get vaccinated? Because there are people, I mean, not everybody can get vaccinated because some people have illnesses, and we need to get vaccinated in order to protect them as well. How can we make sure? We now have the moment that Great Britain started the vaccination plan, and it's already, you know, we don't have, they need to be produced, right, the vaccines. And some experts fear that exactly what Angela Merkel said, that poor countries will be left out, or poorer countries will be left out. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two big aspects to this issue. One is within our countries, and the other is internationally, among our countries, especially the rich countries and the poorer countries. Within countries, I think we have to monitor very closely the distribution of vaccines, who gets them, when, where, and, you know, is there a cost? Hopefully there will not be. And it's clear that there are certain people across every society that should be prioritized. First of all, health workers, broadly defined, not just doctors and nurses, you know, but those working in the community as well. Other essential workers, you know, emergency response personnel and public transportation drivers and refuse collectors and so on, but also older persons, because they are most at risk of death, groups unable to distance, not only people in care homes, but people in detention and in prison, teachers and school staff. If we want to maintain some kind of continuity in the educational system, we have to protect the teachers and school staff, border personnel. And then, of course, groups at a socioeconomic disadvantage. So within societies, we have to make sure that existing inequalities are not reproduced through the unfair distribution of vaccines. But internationally, what we are seeing now is vaccine nationalism. Rich countries have hoarded the vaccines. In the UK, there's 6 vaccine shots for every person. At maximum, you need 2. So what is going to happen with the rest of the world if the dozen or so richest countries in the world have already bought up 80% of all the vaccines? How will this be distributed? Will it be used for political influence? It's clear that there has to be, we really are all in it together, in this sense, that if we don't eradicate the pandemic globally, it will come back again and again and again to haunt us. So we have to look very closely, both within our countries and internationally, how the vaccine will be developed. And this will be, I think, at the heart of the human rights world's attention over the next year, maybe 2 years.
I would be really interested in what the commissioner has to say to this topic, especially on the role the Council of Europe is playing here when it comes to a fair distribution of vaccines. Will you do me the honor?
Sorry, I don't think I can tell you much on this. Of course, I would agree with Niels that equal distribution, and then also wealthy countries helping the rest of the world is something that, of course, human rights community and international organization will follow closely. At this stage, particularly when it comes to the work of my office, I can say that we do look at issues related to access to health and social economic rights that are intertwined and interlinked with this topic. But how the situation will evolve and how the ones that are actually responsible for making sure, including World Health Organization, how this will happen, the time will tell. On this, we will continue raising the issue of access to health and all these other rights that are particularly crucial in the time during, but also post-pandemic or so-called recovery time.
Well, I think we covered a lot in this short period of time. We talked about the issues, the human rights issues, like when the states tackle human rights with measurements in order to help out with the pandemic, or maybe find an excuse. We talked about certain minority groups, about the violence against women, migration, the children's rights. Is there anything anybody of you on my nice panel here, whom I have in front of me, would like to comment shortly before we end this very interesting discussion? Yes, Niels, please go ahead.
Yeah, just one final point. I think it's really crucial to look at how 2 key actors in the human rights infrastructure come out of the pandemic. One is media, and the other is NGOs and civil society, because these are the sources of information for all the international organizations. It's investigative journalists who go out and report on human rights violations and lack of accountability and corruption and so on. And it's NGOs and human rights defenders who help victims. And my fear is that they will both be decimated by the pandemic. Media outlets, because advertising revenues have been destroyed, and those that did not go fully digital are going to be very hard hit. But NGOs, because their funding streams will have dried up, because private donors are not giving as much money, corporate donors neither, state funding is going to other things right now. So my fear is if special attention is not given to media and NGOs and human rights defenders in particular, that these critical building blocks of the human rights infrastructure will be seriously weakened with the pandemic.
And our commissioner raised a hand. You'd like to state something? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. I wanted, it was very much related to what you previously said and asked, and it's related to media. But I will not talk now about media in general. We don't have time, and the time is limited. I would like to mention in particularly what was quite exposed during pandemic, and it's very much related to women journalists and women human rights defenders that were particularly targeted during pandemic, and a very urgent need to support them to ensure both women's rights, but at the same time media freedom. And the specificity of cyber violence against women also requires particular attention and adapted response. When we talk about this is not a new phenomenon. This is not a new social phenomenon or something that we were not aware before pandemic, but still I think it is important to recognize that cyber violence is a specific form of violence against women too often neglected. We didn't have time to talk about artificial intelligence and the impact artificial intelligence has on human rights, particularly during pandemic. As an office, we are also collecting many issues in relation to algorithms and impact of those algorithms on different rights. And we will soon have something to share with public, in addition to our publication of 10 ways to tackle human rights during advancement of the new technologies and artificial intelligence.
Thank you very much. I think it was Mr. Fremuth first and then Rosa Logar. Please, Mr. Fremuth, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. As your initial question concerns sovereignty, globalization, and human rights, I'd like to come back to that in my final comment and combine it with the questions of lessons learned being part of the title of today's event. I think we all know that human rights are an emanation of globalization, and they also contribute to globalization. But so is the pandemic. Yeah, and any response to this COVID-19 pandemic has to be in line with human rights and to be based on the conditions of a truly globalized world. And that includes calls for international solidarity, yeah, of a proper and fair allocation of vaccines and so on. But there is also another message. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres published today. I'm not sure whether I adequately can quote him, but he said, nationalism is no option against the global threat. Yeah, the states have to cooperate, they have to strengthen multilateral options for cooperation, and every option they take has to be in line with human rights, and that could be a positive outcome of the crisis and the lessons learned, to really realize we are living in a globalized world. We are interconnected, we depend on each other. So every attempt to solve international, transnational, globalized problems, be it climate change, be it the pandemics, be it other human rights violations or human rights related topics, depends on cooperation and solidarity. And best case, this could be an outcome of the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rosa Logar, a last comment?
Yeah, a last comment, short comment. I agree with Niels, of course, that free media and independent media and independent civil society have to survive and shouldn't be diminished in the crisis. And I think also, you have to see that there is also a lot of movement going on in the area of civil society, despite all this difficult situation. We have mentioned some here. I want to mention some more. I mean, the fight of the women and men for sexual and reproductive rights in several European countries, especially in Poland, is just extraordinary, and they really deserve all our support and encouragement. But also the people and the women also in Belarus fighting for the freedom from the dictatorship and for democracy is very encouraging. And against the backlash for human rights and women's rights, I also wanted to mention the LGBTI community that is very active despite the hardship they face in many countries of being increasingly marginalized and making it almost impossible for them to work, but they don't give up. People just don't give up. They want their freedom, and they want equality, and they want human rights, and they want democracy. So I think this hope is always there.
Thank you very much. Those were really nice and inspiring words, and I think I would like to leave it there. That was a really interesting evening. We covered so much in such little time, and I think there's probably not. I think there's definitely a lot to cover still when it comes to human rights and the consequences the COVID-19 crisis has on human rights. But I think there's general optimism here, if I'm not mistaken, that people are more aware that human rights will continue to stay strong. And thank you so much for this very interesting discussion and evening, all of you. Thank you very much.